Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world, with me, Joseph Hyatt, standing in for George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri, still here.
Political and media plates shifted again this week as another act of terrorism, mass murder, exploded in Europe. More than 30 people were murdered and hundreds were maimed. ISIS claimed responsibility, and primary responsibility is, of course, theirs. But who and what else is responsible for the apparently unstoppable rise of this fanatic extremism? And what should be done about it?
Russia tried to destroy the base of this extremism in Syria and was then met with implacable threats, insults and sabotage from the very same leaders who had earlier told us that ISIS was an existential threat to the world.
And the so-called moderate rebels continue to benefit from the military and financial support of the West and its allies, though no one can define their moderation, and almost all the weapons end up in the hands of ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
To help us make sense of where we're at is Charles Shoebridge, security expert and former intelligence officer. We will hear from him in a minute, but first I took the Sputnik camera onto the streets of London and heard the voice of the people. Have a look at this.
I think that there is a little bit of responsibility as far as the West meddling goes. The only issue is that I feel like if the West doesn't do anything, there's going to be a continuance of stuff anyway.
I think they know what they need to do. You know, they need to stop interfering in people's business, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Our intervention, especially in Iraq, has caused all this, without any doubt whatsoever. We should have never gone there in the first place. And obviously not solving the Palestinian problem in the first place, going back even longer period of time.
So that was the voice of the people, but now it's time to hear, of course, from our expert, Charles. Charles, we've heard so many stories over the news of the course of this week, so many hours upon hours of broadcast time on this issue, but there never seems to be any real analysis. How can we really gauge the real scale of this terrible extremism threat?
The problem is that there's so many, if you like, vested interests involved in the whole terror story. It's absolutely clear, and this Belgian attack proves, of course, if such proof was needed after Paris, after 7/7 and so many of the horrific attacks, that there is a real and genuine terrorist threat. But it's in the interest of far too many people to overstate that threat, whether it's as a means of getting more powers for the security services and indeed for governments around the world, and particularly in Western Europe and the United States, whether it's a means of furthering the apparent need for more security equipment from security companies, more armed guards, more, shall we say, more scanners and stuff like this. And also, of course, as a means of distraction from perhaps foreign policy failures or even domestic failures at home. So whereas the victims on the street, of course, suffer terribly from these acts of terrorism, and the public more widely suffers, I think, from the fear of terrorism, there seems to be in very few of the vested interests in the West, in the States, in Europe, and here on the streets of London, to actually play down this threat. What we should be doing, of course, is saying that these things are going to happen. Intelligence failures, and of course this is another intelligence failure, will occur, even if there was the best will of the security services to prevent these acts. But that if we compare our current situation, even with this horrific level of attacks, with perhaps what our fathers, our grandfathers, and our other previous generations had to go through in terms of existential threats, we need to keep this in perspective and actually really get on with our lives. And to that extent, those in authority who are actually saying that we shouldn't exaggerate this, but we should just get on with our lives, actually, I think, are accurate.
Well, the word failure you mentioned resonates to a degree because let's not forget Belgium was on practically a state of emergency when this occurred. Admittedly, there was a quick response to the actual tragedy that happened, but why weren't they ready for this?
You're absolutely right. And the fact remains, as I've said for many, many years in regard to this issue, it's actually common sense to say, but nonetheless, it's worth saying that if your intelligence systems fail to the extent that the bombers or the shooters or the terrorists are going to get through to their target, particularly if that's a soft target, like an airport on the land side of the departure, not on air side. For example, these didn't penetrate through to the air side where there is security, or a bus station or a metro station or a cinema or a theatre or a concert or something like that. If the intelligence system fails to the extent the bomber is going to get through, there's very, very little you can do in terms of physical security to protect and prevent that attack from happening. For example, a lot of people are saying, now we spoke about vested interests to some degree. A lot of people now are pushing for the idea that there should be extended security around airports such that all of the airport, for example, the departures area before you actually go through to the security where it is currently. In other words, that the circle of security should be widened, which will cost more scanning even of visitors and so on. But all you will do is simply displace the threat slightly further out. And so then queues of people waiting to go in will be hit. And so really you cannot, if your intelligence system fails, and if you fail to prevent the causes of terrorism as well, which is another subject that needs to be covered, of course, then it's very difficult to physically prevent these, no matter how many armed police you have.
Even the non-liquid policy following the 9/11 attacks has had such an impact on the whole airport regulations. The queues are incredible, and up to today, airports have still not been able to properly manage it.
Well, the liquids issue is a very good point, because there's a lot of dispute amongst experts, myself included, as to the validity or the value of this policy.
Same here.
Because actually, if you think of the threat to Britain, most of the threat to Britain is going to be from incoming flights, people we haven't been able to manage getting on board. But I've flown from, let's say, 5 different countries in the last 12 months into this country. Only on one of those flights were liquids taken off me, because every time I've forgotten to take out the water in my bag, because it's nice to have water on the flight. Only on one occasion, that was coming from Paris, which was via a different route. But on all the other routes I've been on, I've not had water taken from me.
Exactly.
And so you wonder, well, what is the importance of this? And also you realise that, of course, there are so many things once you get to airside that you can buy in the shops and that which you could use to target a plane. So you do wonder what the motivation is behind this, whether it was introduced as a panic measure or maybe there were good reasons initially, and those reasons have disappeared. For example, you can have explosives in liquids. This is the issue here. But guess what? You can have explosives in solids.
Exactly.
In fact, most explosives are solids. But there's no ban on solids.
And it also doesn't make sense, because if only Europe applies this policy, but the rest of the world does not, it doesn't hold up.
But of course, there is a big business interest, which some cynics might say is involved here in providing security searches, scanning machines, and also charging 3 times what you charge for water, etc., on airside as you would landside. But yes, it's one of those factors where the security industry has mushroomed out of all proportion, and as we've mentioned, does very little to actually prevent threats rather than simply displace them.
So just on the intelligence, because earlier you said intelligence failed. So would you therefore agree, or are you still a bit skeptical about Erdogan's claim that actually one of the suicide bombers was in Turkey and he deported them back to Europe, to the Netherlands and then back to Belgium?
I think it's true. Turkey has taken, because it's been forced to take this action by some of its NATO allies. I mean, some of its NATO allies, I think, are genuinely concerned about the threat from ISIS and from terrorism generally, which, of course, Turkey, I don't think it's even controversial anymore to say, has done very little to actually stop the ISIS threat to Europe. In fact, it has fostered it because of its own foreign policy aims in using IS, as arguably the West has, as a tool of its foreign policy in places such as Syria. That is now having a blowback effect. And even the West media says the term blowback. But when we look at the definition of blowback, it means largely self-inflicted. And so it's inherent, implicit in that term that actually we've caused this problem. So yes, I think Erdogan might be sincere when he's now saying, because he's under such intense pressure from parts of the West to reverse his terrorism policies, that now he can just show every now and then that he's deported people and actually I've done my best. But it does raise an interesting issue about intelligence matters, because you do have, as we've hinted there earlier, this is an intelligence failure. And what we find after these intelligence failures by the security services is that these intelligence failures are then used by politicians, by the intelligence themselves.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because surely this is now going to impact the whole EU referendum debate, because this, if we cast our minds back a bit further back, obviously the Paris attacker fled to Belgium from France, obviously under the Schengen Agreement he could. That must really play a part now into politics.
Well, exactly, and it's going to be used by politicians, by the media, and by those who speak for the security services as, experts on TV and radio sometimes, for their own particular aims. And of course, everybody can take something from this. For example, we've had, in terms of politics, you've had some, for example, from UKIP in the UK saying this is an example of why we should have more immigration control. Others, Theresa May, the Home Secretary, saying recently that it's an example of why we need to be in Europe to spread intelligence more widely. But the fact is that actually it's a nice, easy answer to say that this is some kind of external problem. This is to do with the ease with which people get visas or can travel. in almost all of these attacks that have taken place in Europe, the perpetrators have been Europeans. There have been people who have been born in Britain or have been in Britain for such a long time, since childhood. We think about 7/7 and 21/7 from those terrible attacks in London, and in Paris and elsewhere. They are effectively native people. So this is an internal issue for Europe, as well as a foreign policy issue, because, of course, we have to consider how it was that so many hundreds of British, French, German, Belgian subjects were able, and not discouraged in any way by their governments, to go off to get training experience as effectively terrorists in Syria. And these are the kind of questions I'm sure that many Belgians and French people are asking as to the wisdom of that policy of effectively doing nothing until around mid-2013 to prevent these terrorists going off to fight against Assad, and thereby, at that time, of course, arguably serving Western foreign policy.
Which leads to the question, if the Syria peace talks do get resolved, what's going to happen to those British nationals who've joined this death cult? I mean, where are they going to go?
I think we've already seen the signs of what's happening there, and of course it may be that that's what emerges as happened in Belgium as well. We certainly know it's what happened in Paris, where you've got a situation now where IS in Syria is no longer in the safe haven that it used to be, because of the West policies in destabilising places such as Libya, Syria. When we say the West, we don't really mean the West, of course. We mean Britain, France and America. These are the guys who have actually driven this policy of destabilisation. You've got areas now that are ungoverned space. These have become safe haven for groups such as Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra in Syria, or IS. And as a result of that, it was a bizarre situation that, for example, for 3 years, the parts of Syria that IS controlled were the only parts, and Al-Nusra controlled. These were the only place in the world where actually you could go and be safe from American drones against Al-Nusra. So actually the West was backing the creation of these safe havens. And surprise, surprise, this has served as an incubator for these groups. Now that they're under some limited US attack, for sure, but mainly because they're under such heavy Russian attack they've been under, they're of course the IS guys who were there, who were in many ways encouraged to go there by our media as heroes fighting Assad. Now, of course, it's not so much fun for them anymore. They're now coming back in droves.
Well, it's not fun for any of us, and I'm sure it will be a subject we'll be seeing here, of course, again. But Charles, thank you so much for joining us on board the Sputnik. Thank you.
Coming up next, sights you thought you'd never see. The President of the United States of America standing with the Cuban leader Raul Castro in Revolution Square, with the image of Che Guevara looking down on them. Don't miss it.
Welcome back to Sputnik. The long standoff between the USA and its neighbour Cuba, just 90 miles away, moved towards its end this week when President Obama embraced the leadership of Cuba in Havana. It had the hand of history written all over it.
But what will it mean for the US, for US-Cuban relations? And of very great importance to many of our viewers, what will it mean for Cuba? A long-standing advocate of friendship with Cuba is Rob Miller, director of the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, and he joins us in a minute. But first, let's hear what the public in London think about President Obama's visit.
I think it's a good thing that America's opened up relations with Cuba again, but I think it will have very little effect on Cuba, but will probably do wonders for Obama's legacy.
If there is freedom of money coming in, there is prosperity, communism has a natural death.
When Obama lifted the sanctions, he's also brought over with him hordes of multinational, international big businessmen who are really looking at Cuba to try and turn the heads of the Cuban people away from creating their own destiny through that socialist revolution that they had, and perhaps forging a new way forward and really trying to integrate them into a capitalist economy.
Well, it seems a lot of people have an opinion on President Obama's visit in Cuba, but now it's time to hear from our expert, Rob. Rob, what's your take on President Obama's visit to Cuba?
Well, it's been a wonderful visit. It's been a great few days. I'm sure President Obama and his family, Michelle and the girls, enjoyed their time in Havana, as millions of people do every year when they go to Cuba on holiday. And I'm also sure that the Cuban people enjoyed the visit, because for the first time for a long time, you've really seen the possibilities that could come about between these two close neighbours and how that relationship could develop over time. They're very close neighbours. They should be very close friends.
They say when you open the door or window, the flies fly in. What's going to happen when nationalisation kicks in with Disneyland and goodness knows what TNC's landing in Cuba? Do you think it'll be the same place?
I think Cuba will change. I think it will change slowly. I don't think it's going to be a mad rush to embrace everything about the United States. The Cuban people are very, very strong and very, very proud of their nation and their achievements. Their achievements are well known in health, in education, in social care, internationalism and so forth. And the Cuban people are really not in the business of giving that all up overnight. They're very intelligent people, very well educated, and they've seen films of the United States. Of course, there are things people admire about the United States and things that people want, but there's also, as we all know, an awful lot of things in the United States that you could do without. And I've got 2 children of my own, and I know which country I would prefer them to be brought up in. Cuba's a lovely place to grow up in. It's got a vibrant, eclectic atmosphere, culture, and it's a country that I would be very proud to live in, and I know the Cuban people are very proud of that country.
Rob, we know that actually the Congress, they weren't really mad about Obama's trip. The US media, they're not mad about it. So why did Obama do it? What was in it for him?
I think, well, obviously there's a legacy for President Obama himself, and he wants to leave a positive legacy in the region. But I think the bigger picture is the relationship between the United States and the whole hemisphere. The United States has been losing influence within South America in particular, and countries such as Brazil, Venezuela, Argentina, very big economies, and particularly the Chinese have been investing in the region. And I think when you've had many years now of progressive left-leaning countries, the issue of Cuba has been a real block on relations with the United States. And a couple of years ago at the Organization of American States, President Obama himself was almost excluded by the other presidents of the region. And the reason was the blockade of Cuba and the ongoing mistreatment of Cuba. So by opening up that door, opening up that relationship with Cuba, the Americans, President Obama and the business community in the United States is opening up its opportunities within the hemisphere. And that's a very, very important economic mission, if you like. And this part of that opening up and that engagement has been a very important element.
Well, I think it's positively received all over the world. I just question whether it's the same in the US itself.
Well, I think people in the United States are very open to engagement with Cuba. All the polls indicate that the people of the United States want to see normalised relations with Cuba. The key factor has been the relationship or the feelings of the people in Florida, that 1 million plus group of Cuban Americans who have driven forward that aggressive US foreign policy towards Cuba, the country they left after the revolution of 1959. That community is changing. The demographics are changing. The younger generation have grandparents, they have family relations in Cuba, and they want to go backwards and forwards.
They see Cuba in different lights.
Absolutely. And the idea of blockade is no longer relevant to them. They want to go backwards and forwards. They want to meet their families. They want to invest. They want to take up opportunities.
You said mentioned obviously blockade, but when are the sanctions really going to end? Do you see it happening soon?
Well, we want it to happen soon, but it's been a very, very long wait. The facts of the matter are that despite all the talk over the last year of rapprochement, despite the new diplomatic relations, despite Obama's visit and the 4 rounds of bilateral talks between the two countries, the blockade is very much in place. During Obama's administration alone, 49 international companies have been fined nearly $20 billion in total for just trading with Cuba. My own organisation, the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, we've had our bank accounts closed by the Cooperative Bank, who have closed our bank accounts in London because of the blockade. And the chief executive of the Co-op has said it's because of the US blockade policies. Now, if you have a small organisation like the Cuba Solidarity Campaign, unable to trade with Cuba. Imagine what it's like for British and international businesses who are unable to trade. So the blockade has to end. That has to be the first thing on the table.
Well, that's the question, isn't it? Because is this another one of Obama's false promises? We obviously heard one of the first things he admitted he wanted to close Guantanamo. That didn't happen. Do you think this really will be a long-term strategy that will be implemented sustainably for the Cuban people?
I think we have to take President Obama at face value and see that this is something that he believes in. Now, whether that can be carried through by Congress, obviously a lot of the elements of the blockade legislation have to be reversed by Congress, but there are still more things that the United States could do. They could lift the tourism ban on their own citizens travelling to Cuba, and certainly the issue of Guantanamo has to be discussed. You can't have a normalised relationship with a country when the bigger partner is illegally occupying your land against your wishes. It's the only it's the only international base, military base in the world that's positioned in a country that doesn't want it to be there. That has to change. We can't talk about normalised relations until that happens.
Sure. And of course, the real question is, will this actually impact in terms of trade in the favour of the Cubans? Because ultimately, you know, Obama's delegation had people representatives from the likes of PayPal and several huge organisations that represent the kind of tourism and holiday and rentals and etc. So are we actually going to see sustained investment that will actually benefit Cubans?
I think we will see a change, but it will take time. I think international companies have been warned off of Cuba for many, many years. The fines, as I've said, have been horrific and massive. Only a couple of months ago, a British firm, WATG Holdings, was fined $200,000. So it's still going on. Commerzbank, the German bank, was fined over $1 billion this year. So these fines are still in place. And that is a major factor stopping international trade. Cuba's a wonderful place to do business. It's a very stable society. It's got a very highly educated workforce, and it's a population of 11 million people, which needs investment. There are many, many opportunities for international business, and particularly US business. So it will help. The Cubans want investment. It's what they need to develop their country, and they need that development. They want it, and they need to see that progress. So it's something we hope will come out of this visit and out of the discussions that are going along at the moment.
There was this fantastic picture captured of Raul Castro holding up Obama's hand, which was supposed to be a fist pump, but Obama held his hand loose. So apart from that little incident, I think it looked quite a successful trip, this whole rapprochement. I just wondered when they stood there in Revolution Square with Che Guevara behind them, looking really literally upon them. How do you think he would have regarded this visit? And even Fidel, who's still alive, how would they have seen this?
Well, I think the Cuban people, Raul, Fidel, the Cuban people will see it as a victory. I think they've had 50 years of aggression, and now finally the US president has come to them. The Cubans haven't given up anything. It's the United States that need to change. It's the United States unilateral blockade. It's the United States financed aggression against Cuba. So it's the United States that still has a long way to go. Cuba doesn't have to do anything to build a normalised relationship with the United States. It's a purely a one-way ticket. And we very much see this as a victory for Cuba, but the Cuban people are very patient. They've had a long period of waiting patiently and respectfully. They're not asking for anything special. They're purely asking for a normal relationship with a neighbour based on mutual respect and understanding.
Well, the Cuba Solidarity Campaign has no doubt been a neighbour of the Cuban people for many, many years. What does this mean for you as an organisation now, obviously with these steps in the right direction? What's the future for you guys?
Well, as I said, there's still a long way to go with the blockade, with Guantanamo. There are still a number of issues around the migration issues, the Cuban Adjustment Act, the wet foot, dry foot policy, which encourages Cubans to leave the island. There's still United States intervention within Cuba. The Congress has just recently passed $30 million worth of money to fund dissent and opposition within Cuba, so directly intervening in a foreign nation. So there's a long way to go. But at the same time, we as an organisation will spend a lot of time now celebrating many of the achievements of the Cuban Revolution, not only in health and education, but particularly in culture, music, dance and so on. We're organising exhibitions and events around the country, really looking at how Cuba has achieved something that I think we can all look to. Cuba's not perfect, but there's many things in Cuba that we can admire. And certainly people across the South, the developing world, look to Cuba as a sustainable model of development and one which they want to learn from.
Well, I'm certainly sold. We'll have to have you back, Rob. Thanks so much for joining us on board the Sputnik.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
And now, of course, it's time to hear what you think on the realms of digital and social media. What's buzzing away, Gayatri?
Well, Brussels, these suicide bombers, who created these monsters actually? Amy Wyatt says that terrorism against Muslims in the Middle East and in the West, racism, it's a feeling of not belonging, which is about right.
Definitely.
Ciaran says Saudi oil, wealth and Western greed.
I think, look, there's a lot of parties involved in this. It's a very, very busy situation, but it's annoying that we have to put labels, obviously, on nations and people, because no real religion obviously represents terrorism, does it?
Absolutely not. Now, this US rapprochement with Cuba, is that President Obama's legacy, we asked. Keith Fox says, Obama said isolation has not worked. It's time for a new approach. It's actually the same intent with new methods. And Sean Caden says, clean water, free education and healthcare for all. The people of Detroit can but dream of that.
So true. Viva Cuba.
Exactly. And that's all that we've got time for this week.
And that's the end of this episode of Sputnik, with me, Joseph Hyatt, standing in for George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri. You can stay in touch with us on social media, on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, on Facebook, Sputnik on Russia Today. Until next week, it's been marvelous.